I'm introducing us, Amy. I'm with Amy Wax, who is the Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Glenn Loury, Professor at Brown University with the Economics Department in the Watson Institute. The Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs sponsors the Glenn Show. So, Amy, how are you in the midst of this national crisis and this crazy time?
As I said, it would be churlish of me to complain. I am, ensconced in a big suburban house. I have a steady job. I have an income. I'm not in danger of losing my shirt or losing my job. I am married to a medical person who is a bit in the thick of things, so that's something to worry about. Many people in my family are healthcare providers, and they are on the front lines, so I do worry about that. But I otherwise am trying to just, stay optimistic. My whole life has been upended, of course, but that's no different from anybody else.
We cannot complain. I mean, I have to say, my situation is similar to yours. We're academics. We are paid decently. We're in a recession-proof industry, although I suppose we're going to have to wait and see whether classes go back to normal in the fall. I don't think
we're recession-proof. I don't think so at all. I think we're in a sector that's pretty recession-proof. We're sort of in the elite realms of academia, and that's a whole nother story because I think this is going to show the fault lines and the stratification in academia.
Well, I've not heard about tenured professors getting laid off. Is that happening anywhere?
No. I think some people are taking pay cuts. Rutgers, I have friends at Rutgers, and they've announced pay cuts, but nothing serious. This warms my heart, but the administrators, Temple, a big pay cut. And boy, one ideal outcome from this whole crisis would be a paring down of, the lavish layers of bureaucracy at universities. That would be a wonderful consequence. I don't know if that will happen. What I've been saying to people is, and I've mentioned this to you, I think the top of academia is pretty unassailable. It's untouchable because it is this eye of the needle through which people pass to get elite jobs in our society, assuming that our society will continue in something like its present form. That will not stop. And even if they go online for a little while and the experience is much reduced, there's no networking and no mating market and all that, the Harvard degree and the Brown degree will still have cachet. I think that as you go down the pecking order in academia, there is going to be a lot of belt tightening, a lot of rethinking about the value of these lavish institutions. Some of them will fail. I have some friends at small colleges that are fairly reputable and competitive, and they're saying that, there's going to be shakeouts, all kinds of shakeouts. Also, the international student contingent is going to dry up, which I think can't happen soon enough, being something of an America firster here. It's just outrageous how many places we give, for example, to Chinese students. That's going to go away. And of course, that's a cash cow. I mean,
hold on. I just was going to make that point. These people are paying customers. Why would we be in such a hurry to chase them away when they're helping to cover the cost of your salary and mine?
Well, I mean, leaving aside your salary and mine, because that's kind of self-interest, I would say it's a good thing that we're going to chase them away for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, I have a starve the beast attitude towards academia now because I think that is the only thing that's going to bring about any reform. The alumni, the students, the parents, they have no incentive to rein in the massive bureaucracy, the distortion of priorities that comes through all this diversity, inclusion, equity, multiculturalism, and identity politics, which is now pervades everything. It is the dominant theme of academia. And I think it's horribly distortionary. So I'd love to see some of that be tempered. Whether it will, I don't know. I think too many people go to college. So if a lot of colleges fail or go out of existence or have to reduce their tuition, that might produce some reform in that area. And finally, I think that universities have battened on the full tuition from students abroad. We have decided that it's our job to educate the world, and that has come at the expense of the middle tier of our American students. There's now data showing that the least represented group in academia is Caucasians from middle America, your sort of middle class children, mostly males. If we had just a pure numbers qualification.
Excuse me for interrupting. I just want to follow you. When you say least represented, do you mean amongst the faculty, amongst the students? What are you talking about?
No, least amongst the students. They are they are underrepresented relative to actually their credentials. And there are a lot of reasons for that. You may have seen some of these studies. So we are not really getting the full cohort of American students in our universities. Instead, we are bringing in all of these foreign students for diversity and inclusion purposes, as a kind of...
Hold on, Amy. Come on. The Chinese are not coming here. The diversity and inclusion goals of the university are not being met by importing Chinese students. They're being met by admitting...
Oh, I think you're wrong about that.
Oh, really? I don't know how that counts for diversity and inclusion. Chinese students are not counted as minorities in the so-called underrepresented minorities in the university's calculus, are they?
But foreign students are, touted as part of the mosaic that makes these schools international, global, diverse, multicultural. You're right. They don't count for the sort of minority contingent of but they do count. And it's a nice coincidence that they also are a huge source of revenue. Now, what's my problem with it? Well, it's sort of twofold. The first is I really think American institutions should prioritize American students. I think that, I think there is a meet and appropriate element of national priority that the university should show. Secondly, it's a form of leverage that we could exercise internationally. I mean, suppose we said to China, no more Chinese students at Harvard and Yale until China behaves better. This is a valuable, precious privilege to come to these universities. You're a rich country. You're a vast country. You can educate your own people. Why are you coming and taking advantage of our institutions, which are funded by taxpayer dollars? Nurses and truck drivers are paying taxes to support these institutions, which are, of course, lavishly funded and rich. That's just screwed up. That's that kind of priority.
Well, you and I are both at private institutions that are on the whole not supported by tax dollars.
You know how much money they get from the government, and do you know where that money goes? I've looked into this. Okay. Have you ever heard of OPED?
Heard of what?
Do you know what percentage of government grants go to a general slush?
I've heard of government grants. I am not saying that the private universities are not benefiting from public dollars. What I'm saying is I think,
Thank you.
Here, let me give you the example of my department here at Brown. We have a PhD program, and most of our students are foreign nationals, not only from Asia, but also from Latin America and from Europe. And we're a top 15 department, maybe, aspiring to be a top 10 department. We're a very good department, but we're not the best department in the country. But we're a strong department. And we're looking at the best applicants in the world when we decide who to admit. Why would we want to give preference to American nationals in a PhD program? I mean, that seems to run contrary to your otherwise strongly held views about meritocratic admission. I don't think, in talking now about PhD programs, that the young scientists and social scientists that are being trained who come from other countries are being favored because they can pay. I think they're being favored because they are on the merits, the strongest applicants for these programs of study.
Well, I would distinguish between undergraduate foreign nationals and graduate students, although I'm not sure they should be treated all that differently in terms of revenue. Okay, you're right. Undergraduates really do pay full freight, and some graduate students do, not all. But I guess here I would say I'm all for the meritocracy because I believe in competence. I believe talent is scarce. I don't think all people are equal in their capacity to do just this job or that. So let's just put that on the table.
Yeah.
But I have really come to think that to secure the future of our country, which is in trouble in so many ways and is so hard on young people today for them getting jobs, starting families, making their way through society, that it is appropriate to have something like a prioritization of Americans for training, for jobs, for slots, even in the elite professions. So you told me a while back, well, in economics, the foreign students, PhD candidates, leave Americans in the dust. But, that's sort of a endogenous phenomenon to some extent, in that when Americans know that they have to compete with foreigners for scarce positions, and they do to some extent, Glenn, whether you like it or not. I mean, the competition in science and economics in the quantitative fields has become more international. That deters them from studying those subjects and maybe pursuing them. Now, I'm the first one to say Americans have gotten soft, Americans have gotten lazy, Americans maybe aren't as rigorously hardworking as they should be. But in order to encourage that and say, look, there will be positions in labs for you, there will be economics professorships for you, we are going to prioritize you, we're going to put you first, and maybe with a little bit of sacrifice to the meritocracy, if you're talking about the global meritocracy, I think that might well be worth it. I mean, I have a child in graduate school, and he's doing fine, but I do see the effects of globalizing graduate education and globalizing competition. Now, I'm not saying we should never have professors from other countries.
Yeah,
I'm saying
let me stop you for a minute, Amy. The reason I'm smiling is because there seems to be an obvious point that a critic would make here, which is, I thought affirmative action was a bad idea. It was a bad idea when you applied it to Blacks and Hispanics getting into American universities or into graduate programs, but it's not a bad idea when you apply it to Americans. The same argument that says American students might be
action.
I'm being intentionally provocative. The same argument that would argue that American students might be motivated to acquire stronger math skills if they thought they could succeed in getting admitted to a graduate program of study in the STEM fields or in economics or something, could be applied, could it not, to minority students within the United States who, if they were favored for admission to these programs, would have a greater incentive to acquire the skills?
Well, first of all, I don't know that the incentive works for affirmative action, so let's leave that aside. I think what's going on with affirmative action is something else. But look, you could view this as some kind of affirmative action, but that kind of assumes that the relevant pool is the global pool, that national identity and national interests and citizenship and securing the well-being of your country as a group of people who have to live together and support, their setting, their government, through mutual shared interests and sacrifices, that all of that doesn't count for anything. It's kind of to assume this globalist, borderless perspective ab initio. And that is precisely what I'm questioning. I'm saying, of course, merit is really important, right? But there are other geopolitical and democratic priorities that without which we are facing a very grim future as a nation, as a country, and as a society. I mean, we are seeing the effects of the globalist perspective that denigrates citizenship, that denigrates mutual solidarity. I don't know if you've read Ross Dowdett's book about decadence.
I have not.
Yeah, one of the sub-themes there is that we have lost, he doesn't emphasize this maybe as much as some of the other authors do, but I think he should emphasize it more. We have lost this sense of, mutual interest, mutual destiny that comes from identifying as Americans. I'm going to say it, Americans first. The value of, the privilege of, the importance of citizenship and the shared sacrifice. I think the COVID-19 crisis has kind of brought this to the fore.
Let me stop you because I want to deal with this nationalism question first, and I do want to talk about COVID-19 with you. But so I'm thinking a couple of things. One thing I'm thinking, I've often asked myself this as a person who teaches graduate students in economics, and I look out at my classes and I see very few Americans. Where are the Americans? And I worried, this is a very specialized kind of intellectual activity that we're dealing with here. It has large scale implications, for the productivity of society. And we perhaps ought to be more interested in ensuring that at least some minimal part of our program is directed toward training American students. So I have thought that, and I respect that view. And I also have thought, this is apart from higher education, but, as a person who writes and talks a lot about African-American affairs, that the nationalism question, I'm talking about American nationalism for Black people, is a really fundamental question of our time. So I respect this concern about American nationalism. On the other hand, when I pick up a journal, Econometrica, American Economic Review, Journal of Political Economy, and I look at the research, I'm talking about path-breaking, intellectually provocative, profound insights of technical virtuosity. Man, these are beautiful papers, and they're written by somebody sitting in Argentina, or somebody sitting in Germany, or somebody who's sitting in China. And I think, wouldn't I be impoverishing myself as a scientist, a social scientist, if I did not avail myself of the intellectual resources that are a part of a global community? Economics is now, I speak for my field, but I'm sure this is true in many other fields, a global community of investigators who talk to each other. So there's a cost as well as a benefit from an Americocentric approach to technical education, and I'd like to get you to respond to that.
Okay, yeah. So let me. I think everything you're saying is very interesting. First of all, starting at the end. I mean, I am not saying that people other than Americans shouldn't be doing economics. I mean, they obviously, there's a lot of talent worldwide. There are a lot of people who are interested in doing this. They should be doing it. But here's my question, right? And I have a bunch of questions, right? Why, if Argentinians are capable of doing such great economics, why are their universities so bad? Why aren't they producing their own homegrown scholars? Okay, so that's a really important question that I think we can't just elide. And there's a kind of parasitic element here. Like, America has invested, we have, for whatever reasons, built up this wonderful university sector. We have invested both public and private funds to do it, and other people are, quote unquote, taking advantage of it. I'm not saying that this is downright exploitation, but it is a privilege. It is taking advantage of other people's resources. I mean, let's face that, right? Then the second related question is, why are there so few Americans, relatively speaking, who are going into these fields? I mean, we have more people going to college than ever before. Supposedly, it's better than ever. I don't believe that. I think it's worse than ever. Okay, I think the education that we're giving undergraduates sucks. So I'm kind of partly answering my own question. Yeah. It's full of propaganda, anti-capitalist, anti-Western, agitprop. I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
Okay. And, how can we get more Americans to be interested in this very vital field, to devote themselves? And it's hard, right? Economics is hard. It requires sophistication. It requires quantitative study. Why this imbalance? So I would pose those questions to you, starting with the first one. Argentina needs to think about, well, this is part of a broader conversation that we have had before, which is, why is the rest of the world such a mess? Why can't they get their act together, given that there are talented people in places like Argentina and South America and all parts of the world? Why can't they get their act together and have a better, more well-functioning society? Why are they always looking to the Anglosphere and to the West to
I hear you, Amy, and I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but I actually agree with you on the culture argument in terms of some of the exceptional achievements of American society in the 20th century. We're an open society. These universities that people are willing to pay a fortune to attend if they are Chinese, or that attract the most talented people from around the world to our faculty and our graduate programs and whatnot, they are the fruit of an open society. They're a fruit of the liberal foundations of American political culture. I know in my own field, and I'm sure it's true in many fields, that when Europe fell into chaos in the 1930s and 1940s and people fled for their lives, many of them were Jews, not all of them to be sure, we were one of the places that they came to, and the infusion of creativity and profound insight into the disciplines, the ones that I'm familiar with anyway, in mathematics and philosophy and economics. The beneficial effects of this infusion were profound. So they're a credit to the power of a liberal and open democratic order to promote human flourishing, it seems to me. I don't know very much about Argentina. I have a colleague who's Argentinian. He tells me that the university system there is a mess. It's a mess because of cronyism and the political influence on appointments and whatnot that keep the most meritocratic applicants out of jobs unless they toe a party line and so on. Forgive me if this is, to some people, an offensive characterization of Argentinian university life, because I know very little about it. But having traveled around the world and met with academics in other countries, I've often been informed of the fact that, being smart is not good enough to get you to the top of the heap in my country. You have to be a member of the party or a member of the clique, or you have to kowtow to the line or whatever in order to get ahead. And the bureaucracies become encrusted and then closed to outside intervention. So I think that has something to do with, with, you say Anglo-American. Okay, I'll go with that because I think the evidence actually supports that.
Or Europe more broadly. I mean, until the nastiness in mid-century, last century, Europe was doing pretty well in terms of science and its university system. I mean, obviously Hitler in the Second World War messed that up very, very badly. But I think what you're really talking about here, Glenn, is more than just an open society. It's the absence or the lower levels of corruption. Corruption, I think, is underestimated as a destructive force worldwide. And, if you look at books like Larry Mead's book on the burdens of freedom, I mean, it's so much more than openness. It's a sense of individualism expressed as individual responsibility for the moral tenor of society, which is really kind of Anglo-Protestant in many ways, or maybe more broadly Northern European. And that has resulted in very low corruption, relatively speaking, in the Anglosphere and in Northern Europe. And if I were to point to one factor that I think is responsible for making those societies, the city on the hill, the beacon to the world, the places that everybody wants to emulate and wants to go to, I would say it is the low corruption that comes from a sense of moral civic responsibility towards others. And that is lacking. So you're saying, well, now what should we do about that, right? I mean, does that mean now have to take in all of the people worldwide and educate them in our system? We have some kind of responsibility? Well, I don't think so. I think we have the responsibility to be an example to the rest of the world, to not say the sorts of things that you are saying, Glenn, which is, oh, forgive me if I'm offending someone. I can't really say anything about anybody else's culture. That's verboten. I mean, you'll never get anywhere with that attitude.
Okay, let me say a couple things. One is we do benefit from these very smart people coming in here, studying at our universities and staying on and contributing to the society. That shouldn't go unmentioned. But I want to just say a word about your second question, which was, why do Americans not fare better in the open competition in the technical fields? And I think it's because, at least in my area, the kids are not trained well enough in mathematics. They simply don't have the sophistication and the depth of mastery over mathematical analysis necessary to be able to comfortably engage with the frontier of the production of knowledge in a technical field. There are, of course, some who do, but many who do not. And I can remember, and this is going to sound like an old fogey, which may be what I am in some people's eyes, but I can remember 50 years ago when I was an undergraduate student being trained at Northwestern University, that just the status of study in the technical fields was higher. And that was like the level of sophistication of the training that I got as an undergraduate, and this not only explicitly in mathematics, also in economic theory, but also in analytical philosophy. I took some courses as an undergraduate, was very, very serious.
Yeah.
And now I look around and there are still some kids, because you can find it. You can find it in the university if you're looking for it. But it's very easy to get by, to get a good degree from a very good place and go on to get a pretty good job somewhere without ever really scratching the surface of what's going on in these technical fields if you're an American. And the status that's placed on kind of postmodern, kind of trendy studies in the humanities and whatnot. And I'm not only talking about ethnic and gender studies, although I am talking about that.
Right.
You go to a sociology department and you look at what's actually being taught with respect to my colleagues in sociology, because there are some serious ideas in sociology to be taught, and in political theory and so forth, and in literature, and much has been written about this. I just read a book by this historian, David Kaiser. He's a memoir about his life and history.
I know him.
He laments the loss of the rigor and the sense of seriousness about historiography and the trendy kind of identitarian influences in these areas. So I think we're not training our if I had to decide whether I was going to be a woke undergrad going along with whatever the enthusiasm of the day is, or I was going to study some of this really arcane dead white male stuff that is what I actually did study in 1970 at Northwestern University, I'd have never gotten the training that I needed in order to be able to prosper in my field.
Well, Glenn, I mean, this is such a profoundly important discussion. And part of the problem is, of course, that it is extremely difficult to get a handle on what has really changed, because it needs to kind of be studied systematically. right? So I graduated from college in 75. I went to Yale. I was a science major. And whenever people ask me, well, what needs to change in academia? I said, here's what you should do. Go back to Yale in the early 70s. And of course, that was when women first attended. So Korea was a hideously patriarchal and sexist place, all that stuff. I say, go back to Yale in 1971 and do it just that way. Get rid of all the administrators, get rid of all the bells and whistles, the wellness, the diversity and inclusion, this club, that club. Go back and look at the courses. I mean, I took maybe 8-10 philosophy courses, even though I was a biochemistry major. This was serious stuff. Now, there's a lot going on here. The content of the courses are changing. What are people studying? What kind of courses do they choose? When you're a psychology major, what are you learning? When you're a sociology major? If you're a philosophy major, what are you learning? I mean, you look at the course selection. My son was very interested in philosophy at Yale. This was 3-4 years ago. I would look at the catalog with him. I said, look at these bullshit courses. I mean, there's nothing here I would want to take.
Yeah.
There was one course about propaganda. The students called it propaganda about propaganda.
You're right.
I'll give you an anecdote of a student I talked to from Princeton at a conference. This was a couple of years ago. And she said, well, I'm a women's studies and psychology major. And it was a conference about gender differences. I said, well, have you ever heard of, or, we were talking about the greater variance on multiple parameters for men than women, how the bell curve sort of spreads out at the tails for men, and what the implications of that are, which is something that Murray discusses in his book, Human Diversity, which we wanted to talk about, and says has very profound implications. And I said, what do you think of that? And you know what she said to me? I never heard about that. I never heard that, that there's variance. And I thought, Jesus, what is this woman learning as a gender studies and psych major that she's never heard about one of the fundamental findings in the psychometry of gender differences? I really wanted to look at some of her courses. These courses are politically influenced. They are structured with multiple sins of omission. Certain topics are never broached, let alone discussed. Certain authors, certain investigators are ignored as if they don't exist. I mean, I know this because I teach law. I teach a course in conservative political and legal thought. And some of the authors that I read, I'll just give an example, Michael Oakeshott, Edmund Burke, Frederick Hayek. My students have never even heard of, let alone read. And they have gone to the finest colleges and universities in the country.
This puts me in mind of, I did an independent study with a very fine undergraduate student here at Brown, who happens to be a classics major. I mean, he's reading Greek and Latin and all of that, but he's very interested in social issues. And we decided to do a review of the best that we could find written about the question of freedom of conscience and of open expression. And that would include John Milton's Areopagitica. That would include Plato's, Symposium and whatnot, and the Apology of Socrates. That would include John Stuart Mill. That would include George Orwell. And it also included Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind.
Right.
And we read half of that book, and it blew me away, Amy. This is late 1980s. Bloom's book is published. And it's a critical look at the status of American higher education at that time. And it's devastatingly prophetic, in my opinion. I invite anybody to go back and to take a look at touching on many of the things that we're talking about now, about the kind of progressive eating away of postmodernist relativist and identitarian thinking at the foundations of the American Academy. And you just read, I mean, he's got a chapter on sex and gender, and, he's got a chapter on popular culture and music. He's got a chapter on race and affirmative action, or at least he talks about it to a great extent. And I think he nails it. I mean, I'm just going to say that this is Alan Bloom. Yes, Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind. I think, you can see there from his perspective a warning. And unfortunately, much of what he warned about has come to pass.
Yeah, and I mean, it's only gotten worse. I mean, there is so much orthodoxy. There are so many forbidden topics. There are so many taboos. There are so many things that you do not say. The Heterodox Academy just did a survey of students, and which was online, that, 58% of students or more say that they trim what they say, and they trim their pronouncements in class, what they write, what they submit, according to, what is acceptable. So I think that as an influence cannot be underestimated. And, I've said this before, and this is going to make me very unpopular, but there's a certain degree of feminization that is going on as well, right? Which is, higher education as a site of solidarity, mutual support, psychological cosseting, certainly not psychological distress, right? Discord and disturbance. Everybody has to feel good and safe and wonderful. And, that's just completely antithetical to what's known as education. But
everybody is above average. Everybody has got to get an A grade. You talk about corruption.
Yeah. So
not being able to give a C, not being able to give a C is a profound corruption. Okay. And I'm basically unable to give a student a C. I mean, I do if forced to.
Right.
But the sense of entitlement, the sense the students have that I want to go to law school, I want to go to medical school, I've got to get the internship, I've got to get whatever, you're killing me, you're destroying my life, I'm going to go home and kill myself if you don't, relent, if you don't relent. And it just eats away at the capacity to make discriminating judgments about performance. And it's a kind of, and the entitlement that these kids, I don't know what it's like at the University of Pennsylvania, but I can tell you about it at Brown, and I teach undergraduates. The sense of entitlement that these kids have to expectation. They'll write me letters like, I know my performance has been not so good in the course so far, but I really think it does not reflect my true abilities. And is there anything that I can do in order to whatever? And and it makes me want to throw my hands up. And I wish we had a system where I could just teach and then somebody else could do the evaluation. And I would want them to do it as rigorously as possible, but it wouldn't be on me to have to manage my relationship with these people as a pedagogue on the one hand, with my responsibility to evaluate them on the other, because it's at that point that they come to me and they throw their whole lives in front of me and they say, please don't kill me, please don't destroy me. And I'm unfortunately not tough enough to say, to hell with it, you're getting a C, okay, because that's what you earned in this course. I just find that very, very difficult to maintain.
Well, at Penn Law, if you give a C, you're immediately visited by some, ombudsman contingent and asked to justify yourself. But it's very interesting, Glenn, what has happened as a result of this COVID crisis. Never let a crisis go to waste. One result has been a wholesale assault on the meritocracy. Let's get rid of grades. Let's get rid of the SAT. I mean, that movement has been humming along forever. I just reviewed Dan Markovitz's book, The Meritocracy Trap. And one of the things I said in the review is, oh, come on, you have all these allies who would love to get rid of any sort of distinction, discrimination, any sort of ranking or rating. You hardly mention them. The whole contingent of goodbye grades, goodbye tests is getting ever more powerful. And it has gotten results with COVID. All of the top law schools abandoned grades this semester. They are pass-fail. And I'm not teaching this semester, but speaking to my colleagues, their view is we're going to throw the exams down the stairs. I mean, would you dare give a student an F? And of course, there's the danger that we'll give the F to the wrong students, and I don't need to say more. Right? Yeah. The whole system is now driven by the lowest common denominator, because we have this virtue signaling fantasy that we have all of these disadvantaged students at Penn Law, which of course is a joke. We don't. They're holed up in some tiny apartment with 12 screaming kids, so they can't study, they can't read, they can't do their work. So we really have to just get rid of grades because it's unfair to the poorest among us. We're driven by the least among us rather than the need to distinguish people at the top. And of course, it's the students at the top who will be harmed by this.
Yeah, let me just observe.
They will not be able to distinguish themselves.
We've had this at Brown. There was a movement for universal pass no credit. That is, all the courses would automatically, in virtue of the COVID-19 crisis, revert to a grading regime of pass no credit. Right. That's an option. That's an option that students can take. They can declare themselves pass no credit at the beginning of the semester, and then their performance is evaluated on that dichotomous basis, and they typically will pass. On the other hand, if they do so, they will be seen in their transcripts to have elected pass no credit, and hence an employer will not perhaps give them the same degree of, positive weight for passing a course when they realize that the student elected not to be graded in the course. So a pass doesn't have to add up to an A. A pass might be discounted by an employer if the student elected pass no credit. So the point of this movement, in virtue of COVID-19, was to have universal pass no credit. So it was taken out of the student's hands, so the employer could not impute any motive to the student if the student presented a pass, and the burden of having to perform for a letter grade would be taken off of the student's shoulders. And the justification for it, Amy, excuse me, was that it was unfair to so-called marginalized students.
Right.
Okay, now these were low-income students, first-generation students, racial minority students. And here's what I thought. I thought the ability to get A's is precisely how a so-called marginalized student stops being marginalized as an individual, not as a member of some race or ethnicity, but as an individual. The ability to get the A is the exact antidote to marginalization. And now you've relieved me of the responsibility, but you've also taken away the opportunity for me to distinguish myself as a marginalized student. The non-marginalized students have so much else going for them. They don't necessarily need to be able to present a 4.0 transcript, hardly earned through difficult effort, to show their mettle.
I know, but see, all of this assumes that there really are distinctions, that those distinctions matter, that there are people who know more or less, that are more capable or less capable. But there's a whole contingent of people, and I've seen memos to this effect coming out of legal academia, who contest every single one of those propositions. Now, they can only do that because they're ensconced in this bubble of academia. Talk to some law partners. I have law partners in Philly that I know, and I've asked them about this. What's going to be the effect of going to pass-fail, of getting rid of grades for the COVID period? And they all say the same thing, which is, one way or another, by hook or by crook, we are going to figure out who the better students are or the less good students. Now, all the Penn students are reasonably good. It's not like people don't get jobs, but there are tiers in the legal profession. They're just going to look at the grades that exist, and they will disregard the performance where they have no signal from the college or the law school. And, there's just no way around that. I mean, the people who want to jawbone this issue to make these distinctions go away, they're trying to change reality, Glenn. They are change reality through
There was
rhetoric.
a post on the op-ed page of the Times a few days ago where someone argued, don't get rid of the SAT, ACT.
Yes.
And this was exactly the argument. The argument was people have to make decisions based on the information available. If you take away that information, they'll make it based on other information. Guess what? That other information is less favorable to the disadvantaged racial minority, et cetera, than, like, if I have to go
and
on
less reliable.
it's less reliable, and it's also less advantageous. You know, if I'm upper middle class person and I present myself well in an interview, I get to impress the person. If they have nothing else to go on except what they saw in the interview, the person who's come up from the hard side, the wrong side of the tracks or whatever, who's not quite as polished, is not going to look as good in the interview, but they might be twice as smart. They've been deprived of the opportunity to demonstrate that.
Right. And people are just dopey about the value of subjective versus objective metrics. I mean, you know, interviews are notoriously distortionary, notoriously unreproducible. They favor people who already get it, right, and have style and breeding and background. Yeah. I mean, it's really just totally disastrous. But of course, you know, the games that these colleges are playing with the SAT. So making the SAT optional, of course, is a way to improve your numbers, get more applicants, because a lot of people with bad SATs will just not submit them. And therefore, you can swell the denominator for your U.S. News ranking. You can make your SAT average look great, but because only the good SATs get submitted, you can hide what you're doing with affirmative action, right? So nobody can look at the data because the data will no longer be valid. I mean, the game playing is just absolutely endless. And of course, we just let the universities do this. Now, you know, my hope is that there will be some degree of disillusion setting in with this COVID-19 crisis. I can't be sure that it will happen. My guess is we don't know. We actually don't know what's going to happen to the higher education sector as a result of this COVID crisis. Once again, I think the upper tiers are going to be fine because they have this incredibly valuable product that everybody wants and people will pay infinitely for. And even if you might not have a cool first semester on campus at Harvard and not get to network, you still are looking at a Harvard degree. But the middle tier of schools, the small colleges, the expensive, less selective places, I don't know, they might actually, some of them go out of business. We might shift to vocational education, which would be all to the good, to more of a European system.
My president here at Brown, that's Christina Paxson, had a piece in the New York Times, 10 days ago or so, arguing that we really needed, that is, we in higher education, to start preparing to make sure that we opened in the fall with the appropriate precautions. She said what you just said, which is that we'll probably weather this. Places like Brown, we have a multi-billion-dollar endowment and so on. Wealthy alumni and, a lot of Chinese students paying full tuition. But the middle tier would probably suffer more. She took a terrible beating in some of the commentary and the reaction to it because it was alleged that she was somehow promoting and opening up too soon, giving insufficient concern to the safe, quote unquote, the safety. Although she went out of her way to point out that the universities had to prepare for the management of the campus life in the age that we live in with viral infection and so on. And she was not unmindful of the safety concerns, what to do about students who might fall ill and so on, how to arrange for large lecture classes and so on. And protocols.
I have two reactions to Paxson, okay? One is, the pro bono affair remark. She would say that, wouldn't she? But the second is, I'm kind of sympathetic to we need to just kind of power through and get back to normal point of view. There is a whole contingent on the right that is very skeptical of the lockdown. And I'll give you my reason for being somewhat in that camp. I think the initial measures were appropriate. In fact, we should have taken more draconian measures at the beginning, like banning all flights from foreign countries. Of course, the mainstream media would have screamed bloody murder about that and then covered it up and pretended that they didn't. But the reason I am sympathetic to we need to get back to normal is really twofold. First of all, this whole zero risk precautionary principle, we need to create the utopian world where nobody gets COVID is just, part and parcel of a certain hothouse flower upper middle class attitude of safetyism that just doesn't work for society as a whole.
You're channeling Heather McDonald now. I assume you've seen what she's been writing about
I
this.
am, right? But this is part of a broader discussion of safetyism.
Yeah.
Secondly, the initial goal of the lockdown was never zero infections with COVID-19. I mean, this is related, right? Because that is impossible. I mean, in order to achieve that, we would have to come to a grinding halt in every aspect of our society. I think that we just need to wrap our minds around the fact that we have not conquered infectious disease. We went through a period where we much reduced the danger from infectious disease due to some very wonderful salient discoveries and advances in medicine. And that's a terrific thing in both in vaccination and in antibiotics. But viruses are very cagey, and this one has escaped our ability at the moment to tame it. And that is just part of being a biological creature. Okay. Now, in a way, as awful as COVID is, we're lucky because the death rate from COVID is actually pretty damn low. It's not the bubonic plague, it's not smallpox. Someday we may have something like that, and then things will really be awful, right? This is a sort of single digit or less death rate. It disproportionately affects people with comorbid conditions, older people. Yes, some middle-aged and younger people get hit by a ton of bricks, but it's very, very rare. Okay, so we just need to realize that the goal of perfect safety is not going to be achieved. Now, there are a lot of discussions of, well, it's morally relative to say that there are trade-offs, the whole Cuomo line. Well, that's just the wrong way of thinking about it. Okay?
Well, I've been saying that here. I mean, people who watch the Glenn Show know that. I've been saying that here for a month now. There's no avoiding the necessity to trade off various kinds of costs and benefits, and the refusal to acknowledge that leads to bad decision-making in which, in effect, you incur costs, notwithstanding the fact that you are unwilling to measure them for benefits that don't justify it.
So we need prudent and calculated risks. Now, the problem with prudent and calculated risks is we have terrible leadership, and I am here tarring the right and the left. Our politicians.
Well, it's a structural problem. Excuse me for interrupting him. It's a structural problem. I was saying this, talking to somebody the other day. You, in a crisis, need to be very careful what you do, because anything you do, you might have a hard time stopping to do it. Okay, because the herding behavior. I mean, what governor in the Northeast is going to open? Okay, to open could be a mistake. It literally could be a mistake. But if you're with the herd and none of them open, you're not ever putting yourself in the position of being the one who deviated from the pattern and practice and therefore are responsible for killing people.
That's part of safetyism. Okay, so
once we start down the road, it's very hard to stop.
But you can admit your error and adjust. You see, there isn't that kind of flexibility and that humility of, well, we're going to try this and we're going to reassess in a week or two, which of course makes perfect sense.
Because nobody wants to be the first mover doing that reassessment.
Well, right. And I mean, here's the other thing. It's really hard to find that sweet spot because there's no absolutes involved between protecting the elderly. We don't want to throw grandma under the bus. Well, of course not. Honor thy father and thy mother. Yoram Hazony wrote a piece that really spoke to me that we do need to care about our elderly, right? But on the other hand, any viable society has to worry about the future of its young people. Yeah. I see the hit that the 20-somethings are taking from this. It is absolutely devastating on top of all of the difficulties they were experiencing already, right? From overcrowding, expensive real estate, a difficult job market, the shutdown of mating markets, the decline in marriage, which is very, very concerning. I mean, the fact that fewer and fewer people are getting married, fewer and fewer women are having children. I mean, this is a formula for long-term unhappiness, regardless of what some people think. and all of this is being sacrificed. So, there is a way to balance these interests. Now, Sweden, right? So my view is God bless them, because they have always had a kind of pragmatic, I think, hyper-realistic approach to old age, to death, to just the natural evolution of life. They recognize that if you're, 85 or 89 or whatever, heroic measures are probably not appropriate. They're probably not going to do that much good. And they do involve enormous numbers of societal resources. And so these people do self-regulate. They don't seek to do everything, which is, of course, the kind of rhetoric that you get in the United States surrounding treatment. And they're a very highly disciplined, rule-following population. Well, we're not. Okay,
so they're going for herd immunity, basically, and they have a slightly higher death rate than Denmark or Norway or Finland. And the experiment is still ongoing. We're going to have to see what happens.
Yeah, we'll have to, right. So it's really a work in progress. But the question is, could we have that model here? And, I just don't know. I mean, I see a lot of people defying the lockdown at a time when the lockdown, really was important and has flattened the curve. The initial goal was to not overwhelm the healthcare system.
Yeah, I remember.
And we just sort of forget that goal. I told someone there's an analogy to affirmative action. The initial goal of affirmative action was remediation. We shifted to diversity, but we keep reverting to remediation, right? In the way that we think about it. Well, no, you have to choose your theory. And our theory was flatten the curve, make sure the healthcare system can handle it. We've done that, actually. That's a success story, I think. It's been difficult. New York is still a hot spot, but other places have managed sort of. But it's not to go to zero. So what we really need is to think about the measures we need to take and the measures we don't need to take. I have said all along, you can get 85% of the benefit, and a doctor friend of mine in the conversation said, no, 90%, from a few measures, right? Hand washing, face covering, social distancing to some degree, and self-quarantine if you're sick. Take those 4 measures. Now, those 4 measures do not require closing 98% of businesses.
Testing, contact tracing. Where are they in your?
Well, I think contact tracing is a very overwhelming task. Contact tracing and testing are very, very hard to do, okay? Because contact tracing in our ragged society, our live free or die society, is very imperfect. So you can do some of that, but I don't know how much. The testing part, which everybody talks about, the New York Times just obsesses over, which is suspicious, is not working because the tests are wildly inaccurate, Glenn. I mean, if you have a 20% false negative rate, a 25% false negative rate, how can you rely on the result of any test? Antibody testing, still, in the development phase, not terribly accurate, not terribly useful, not even clear that having antibodies or not having antibodies has any significance medically. The science just isn't there.
Not yet.
I don't know how much potential there is for testing, right? But it's a technocratic solution. The mainstream media just loves it. It's a way to flagellate and beat on Trump, right? Because as you know, everything's Trump's fault. And in addition, and this is really leading us astray, if Trump's in favor of it, it's a bad idea.
No, I think it's an important point. I have watched Bill Maher. I know you probably don't. He had Matt Taibbi on his show last Friday, the journalist Matt Taibbi, who's a pretty straight shooter, has been in any case about the impeachment stuff and the Russia hoax, as Trump would put it, stuff. And one of their points was the hyper hatred of Trump, the negativity of Trump, that Trump can't be possibly right about anything attitude, was making it impossible to know what was happening in the world because you can't read the newspaper and learn anything from it. This is Bill Maher, a liberal, and Matt Taibbi, a more or less centrist Democratic journalist. You can't know what's going on. Taibbi says, I go to the European press to try to know the facts about something like hydroxychloroquine. You know, if you wanted to just know the facts, you can't find out the facts from reading American sources because they're all so influenced by the implicit agenda of denying any credit.
Absolutely. And of course, they'll contradict themselves. I mean, you know, if someone said it, it might be right. But then if Trump goes ahead and says it, it's got to be wrong. So today in the New York Times is just emblematic of that attitude. Top of the, you know, masthead, Stephen Miller and the Trump administration wants to borders. It's like, come on, guys, let's just show a little common sense. You know, we're not saying that everybody who's coming into the country has COVID. We're not saying that. We're saying we've got our hands full right now trying to figure out who among the people who are here already have it. Why do we need this influx of people with their own degree of COVID?
The very sensible concern that we need to be careful about who crosses the border because we're trying in a lockdown to prevent the spread of disease gets portrayed as he just labeled all migrants as a disease sickness. You see how racist that is. And I thought, come on, this is propaganda. This is not reporting the news. You're trying to manipulate me. This is an editorial, not a news report. I thought as I read that story in the newspaper this morning. So, you know, I definitely agree.
I only had to read the headline and I said, you know, this is propaganda masquerading as news. It's an effort to, you know, get me to think a certain way and to get away from something that's just
Let me ask you about this. So Pompeo yesterday, this is a Monday, yesterday was Sunday, there were the news shows, was interviewed. I can't remember if it was Meet the Press, Face the Nation or whatever, but he said, we don't know where the virus came from, but there's a lot of evidence that it might have come out of a virology laboratory in Wuhan in China, and we're going to get to the bottom of that. Okay. And I read the newspaper, and the newspaper is, administration is pressuring intelligence agencies to find evidence that the virus came from a Wuhan laboratory. And I said, well, if there is evidence that it came from the Wuhan laboratory, wouldn't we want to know the evidence? The fact that the evidence was generated as a consequence of the administration saying, I want you to look into this, is not discrediting of the evidence.
And it's not.
Their claim is inside unnamed sources are saying that the intelligence people might be incentivized to find what the administration is looking for because they wouldn't be objective since they want to make the boss happy. And I say, my God, you're going to preemptively discount evidence of the source of the virus because it might conform with something that somebody in the administration, in this case, the Secretary of State, is saying. I mean,
and it's not even clear, like, what's wrong, you know, what agenda is being advanced by this. Now, I happen to know someone in the local scientific community who is a top virologist and a top vaccine producer. I've talked to a number of people, and they say this is a perfectly plausible hypothesis. I mean, there is evidence that one of the first people that had the virus worked in that lab.
I didn't know that.
Is in Wuhan. It does exist. It is, you know, they are cooking up or they are studying all this stuff. I mean, there is nothing bizarre about this hypothesis at all. It doesn't mean it's true. It's certainly worth investigating. And, you know, to tar it as a Trump conspiracy theory, that is distortionary by definition. So when I look at the New York Times, I just sigh. I really should stop reading it.
You're invited to take the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda in preference to the pronouncements of your own government.
Well, right. And I do not understand this romance that they have going with China. there. I mean, I do, because I've talked to people who are, China captive. They're Sinophilic. And, there is this tendency among the people who study these foreign cultures to be kind of won over by them. There is, I don't know what the source of it is, but it is a definite psychological tendency to kind of go native. And I see it in the people who have always been attracted to China, love China, learn Chinese, are interested in China. In a way, I saw it the opposite when I was at Oxford in the 1970s. There was this small contingent of Brits who just, should have been born American because they loved everything American.
I was about to say, I mean, China, isn't it the kind of the America at the end of the 19th century coming into its own, early 20th century, where a lot of Europeans would have been fascinated by what was going on? Isn't that kind of analogous to the fascination that many people have with the profound phenomenon, which is the transformation of China in the last half century? I mean, it really is a world historic event, and I can't blame people for wanting to know more about it. If I were younger, might well be attracted in that direction myself. So it doesn't have to be the mindless, sycophancy. It can also just be a stunning curiosity about this profound phenomenon, which is the advent of a modern China.
Yeah, so let's admire them for what they've accomplished, because they have lifted many, many people out of poverty and, saved many people from famine and starvation. I give them all of that credit. They are fascinating. They are an alternative culture. But, here's my view of it. And maybe it's just because I don't have a utopian bone in my body. Be very, very wary and be very, very suspicious of these people. No, they do not share our values, or at least certainly not all of them.
Yeah.
They are almost entirely self-interested, certainly as a regime, and they are pretty unscrupulous. So, I really think we need to be extremely self-protective, and that would be my attitude. And that doesn't seem to be the attitude of, the powers that be, the bien pensant. It's very, very puzzling to me.
Amy, I'm going to let that be the last word. We're over an hour now. It's a wonderful conversation. We'll come back to Charles Murray's book, Human Diversity, which is a blockbuster that deserves to be seriously considered. So I look forward to discussing it with you in, a few weeks or whatever.
Yes, Glenn, we absolutely have to do it, because I studied this book in great detail and I do have lots to say about it. Okay,
so we'll do it. People can look forward to that. But meanwhile, let me thank Amy Wax, Robert Mundheim Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, and a frequent guest here on The Glenn Show. And I'm proud to have you as my friend, Amy. So take care of yourself.
Bye. Thank you.